Welcome. Welcome to our fourth volume or fourth um, offering in our series of Can You Hear Me Now? My name is Reverend Dr. J. Anthony Lloyd. I pastor the Greater Framingham Community Church, and I pastored this year is my 30th year in ministry as senior pastor. I also serve in 30-some years now, adjunct faculty member for Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in the Boston campus, where I look forward to teaching in the area of leadership. We've talked in a previous one about finances, but there's so much more to be said regarding finances. And today we want to talk a little bit about some more aspects of this nature of finance, but also fundraising as well. Fundraising seems to be on everybody's mind. Well, it seems as if we can't escape it no matter what we do. Fundraising is a part of it. Sometimes fundraising involves the small little events, one for which we pull together a ministry team and we're going to fundraise for a particular situation. It's important in those kinds of scenarios that we decide clearly what is our goal. We want to know what is the expense in order to pull it off. We want to know what the income we expect to bring in. And we want to know what the profit margin is. How much money will we make? And that's important. Sometimes we expend a lot of energy trying to raise money, and at the end of the day, after everything's paid, we have very little show for it. Now, that may be a goal for you, because there is an aspect of ministry that's involved not so much of how much money we raise as it is that we're raising the awareness of the ministry. We're raising the stature of the ministry. We are sometimes just desire is to say, this is not about raising money. This is just about people getting together. Sometimes we call it friendship ministry, friendship raising. And so those are important aspects. There are. But when you talk about you want to raise some money, that means we're talking about taking time to figure out exactly what our goal is. And then what does it mean to reach that goal? And what does success look like if we were to reach that goal? That's important no matter if it's a small project or a large project in what we're doing. I think the process of getting there is as important as the end product. What do you mean by that? What I mean by it is that sometimes what ministry is really about is not so much that we reached our goal as is the experience that people had in working together, living out what it means to be the body of Christ, to go after a goal. If we're clear about our goals up front, then we have something to measure when we get to the very end of what the product is. Sometimes the measurement is done in dollars and cents, but sometimes it's whether or not we had a good experience, or whether everybody had a great time when it happened, or whether at the outcome of the process is that we know each other better than we did when we started this process. So there are various goals that come into it. Well, you've got to decide ahead of time, which goal are we going after? And we can have multiple goals and we do it, what have you. And there may be at the end of the process, we may say, guess what? I met this goal, but this goal I did not, what have you. That helps us to measure what our definition of success is when it comes to this nature of raising money and fundraising and what that means. Now, when I think of also fundraising, I think of larger projects. One of the great ones is capital campaign. When we talk about capital campaign, that means that we are raising money, significant money, that really is going into infrastructure or the purchase of property. Something is sustainable. And in order to do it, some ministries elect to say, I'm not going to do anything until I have all that money up front. That's great. If you have a ministry and you're financially sound that way, that's great. But this day and age, it really, most cases, involves going to some lending institution to say, we would like for you to invest in us and lend us money. Now, I want to suggest some nuggets to get yourself prepared for that meeting so that the outcome of your discussion with a lending institution is a positive one where they agree to actually invest and lend you money. And some of these nuggets are parts that we don't even give any thought to. I can remember when I came to this present ministry, I arrived Palm Sunday. At that particular time, we had a small building, and in doing that, we soon outgrew that building and had to go to double services in order to accommodate people who wanted to be a part of the ministry and attend for worship. That means double services, and that in itself is a whole challenge right there. But at that point, I began to look to say, we must purchase a larger facility in order to do ministry. Now remember, it is in that deciding to do that, is that it's for the purpose of doing ministry. It is not for the purpose that I can build a building or build a kingdom there and somehow my name is on it and all that kind of stuff, or anybody's name on it. It is not for a structure that exists there and on the corner and you can say, there it is. But it is for the purpose of doing ministry. I can remember, and in that, starting searching. And I'm riding around at that particular time. I'm riding in the police car with the police chief of town, and I remember saying to him, see that building right there? We're going to take it, and we're going to purchase that building, and we're going to make it into our new church home. And I can remember him as he's driving, he turned to me and said, Reverend Lloyd, your folk are not going to do that. And I remember that ringing in my ear. Him, as a police chief, failure to understand that this was our aspirational dream that we were going after. And we believed that God was in this. And it meant a lot of sacrifice and working. But I remember the day when we dedicated, I made a point to invite him to make sure he got a chance to come in there, that it might be a witness in this process of what it means to take it and go after something, namely a big piece of property, capital investment, or what have you. Now, in doing so, it's important that we get our house in order ahead of time as we think about asking people to an institution, of lending institution, to put money, because they are giving money because they believe in not just whether you can pay the money back, but they believe that you can be successful in this campaign and in doing this ministry. So it's important. Now, things that they will be looking for. One, they will certainly want to know what has been the giving trends or giving pattern for the last 3 to 5 years. You need to be able to show documentation. They're looking for history. They want to know whether or not other people have believed in this ministry and whether or not they ought to give you money because others have said yes to this ministry. They are going to be looking whether or not there have been changes. And it's not so much that you have changes as it is your ability to explain what the changes were. Why were the receipts dipped in that year? Why were they high in this year? What was going on? What were the dynamics to it? That's called a narrative that goes with these here budget numbers of giving. When we talk about that, we really ought to talk about the ways in which people give. Sometimes we talk about restricted and unrestricted giving. Restricted giving means that someone has decided to give you money or stocks or what have you, and they have specifically spelled out the purpose for which they are giving it. And you are called to honor that restriction. It's restricted giving. And you are to spend the money in accordance with what is agreed upon and what they've shared in the beginning of why they were giving. That's restricted. And then there's the unrestricted, where a person says, I want to give ministry to the church, and I'm not going to tell you how to spend it. I just believe in what you're doing, and I'm giving you this money. I'm giving you these stocks. I'm whatever they're giving you. That's unrestricted. Now, I'll share with you that sometimes what happens in ministries is that we have a lot of restricted dollars. I can only spend the money in this particular area where it's designated, and not enough unrestricted, where there's room for me and the board and the church to decide creatively how we're spending it. So you need to be clear with folk ahead of time when they decide they want to give to your ministry and where they want to give. Sometimes they will ask you, tell me what your needs are. And you ought to be able to have a perspective that's put together that says, these are the needs that we have, and this is what the funding in order to do it. And they want to make a decision as to whether or not they give. So when you talk about lending institutions, they want to know, what have you done with restricted dollars? What have you done with unrestricted dollars? Have you documented it? Have you used it for its purpose? It's all about the purpose and what you're giving. The next thing is that they want to know a description of what your assets are. What are the assets of a church? What land do you own? What property do you own? And that can range from buildings to the vehicle that you have, equipment in the church. Those are your assets. Assets sometimes are fixed assets. That means they start off, they have a set point of value and what they are. Assets can change in value from year to year. And their value in most cases, they go down, not go up. But there are those kinds of assets, and the lending institution wants to know. Sometimes we have to be creative and say, I don't have enough of these here bullets in place. And they may ask for someone to, in essence, become a co-signer with you in your purchase of what you want to go. That means it's usually somebody in the church who says, okay, they have their financial picture in order and they're willing to co-sign, which means in essence to say, if the church can't fulfill its obligations and pay it back, then they are willing to step in. Now, I'll tell you, the day used to be when nobody would ever foreclose on a church. Those days are over. The reason before was banks and lending institutions do not want a bad press out there that you foreclosed on a church. Those days are over. So therefore, the scrutiny that a bank will want or lending institution up front to ensure that, yes, you're able to pay that loan back. It's important. It feels like a lot of hoops to jump through, but I encourage you to do it. They also want to know, what is your mission? What's your mission statement? What is your mission that you are involved in? Internal and external. Because they in themselves, as a lending institution, they're required to invest in the community for which they are operating in. Most folk don't even understand that. So my community banks, my other banks, they're required to invest in community. And that investment is outright giving in the community, but it's also where they are lending in community. So they become a partner with you. One of the things and challenges in there, most lending institutions will say, if I lend you money for a capital campaign, I want you need to do all of your banking business with us. That can be a challenge for folk because you want to have the freedom. But I'll tell you right ahead of time, most will say that because that's where they're going to be making their money. They're going to be making their money on this issue that you do all your banking with them. So heads up, that's what comes down the road for that. If you have designated funds, such as you're doing a building fund, I don't know, every church got a building fund. Well, they want to know what has been the giving toward the building fund. They will want to know if someone has pledged to give. They want to know whether or not the pledge has been honored. They want to know whether or not someone pledged it, but they never fulfilled in funding that pledge. They want to know that as a history because that paints a picture about who you are. Another very important part they will ask you, and that is, what is the description of your liabilities? Your liabilities. And liabilities are from mortgages to leases to whatever that you are already committed to in giving a percentage of your money in payment to. Because they're looking at trying to get a balanced picture of who you are as an individual and as an institution in the community. Now, those are things that they will ask you to write up, draw up, supply documentation to prove this is who you are. They're trying to get a picture about who you are on one side of it. The other part, which we don't give a lot of attention to, is the fact is that they want to know who you are in the community. They want to know what is your reputation as a church. I go so far to say they want to know what is your reputation for you as the pastor or the leader of the church. That's why you want to make sure your rep out there is one that's accurate to what your mission is. So that, listen, they will do their homework. They will ask other people in the community, other institutions, tell us about so-and-so church. Tell us about so-and-so. Is that person a person of integrity? That is helping them to paint the whole picture about who you are in ministry. Don't be surprised. Most lending institutions will say, you want a large number of dollars from us? Then guess what? You need to pay and take out what is called a key person's insurance. A key person's insurance. Sometimes they literally say key man insurance. What it basically is, it says, you as an institution, you pay an insurance that helps to guarantee the loan that you're getting, so that they wrap that around the fact is that if you as the leader of that church decide to leave, or for some reason unable to give leadership to this church, there's insurance that pops in that makes sure the lending institution gets their money. If the church decides to fold, they're not about lending money where money is going to go down the drain. So it's called a key man or key person insurance. That is based on who that key person is. Most cases, it's the pastor. And taking out that insurance there, it's an extra added bill for church. You need to calculate that in because you may have to pay the loan back, but you still got to pay key man insurance loan. In essence, this helps them to guarantee and some security about the payment and repayment of that loan. Let's be honest. They don't give you all the money for what you're going to do. Most cases, it is that they will calculate a loan based on up to maybe as high as 80% of what your assets are in value. Some won't even go that high. But they're basically looking at saying how much money and what you're worth as an institution in community, what have you, and then give you a loan that goes up to 80%. They are bound by percentages from both the federal and the state in terms of their coming in and auditing their books and saying, you can't give out a loan with that kind of high rate or low rate percentage. So they're governed by rules that they have to abide by in order to lend you that money. But remember, they really are called upon to invest in the community. That means you ought to do some homework. Check out where a bank is giving money at in your community. All right? And as a church, it does not mean that we are somehow prohibited from getting that kind of money. Not at all. They're not going to pay for us to propagate the gospel, but they will pay for other things that are part of what brick and mortar for this particular ministry and what you're doing because you are impacting the community. And that's where it comes down to. So that's important. Term of the lending. There's a term involved. They may be and say, okay, we'll give you this loan and in the space of 15 years, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, at the end of the term, the expectation is you have paid that loan back. They are by guidelines that they have to operate when they put that in. But it's your responsibility. You can push back. You can say, I want a favorable term. I want terms that are manageable in that payment and what have you. Part of that is also the nature for which what the closing rate is for interest rates. Right now, they're skyrocketing, they're moving up. And so when you lock it in, you lock in there. And what that interest rate, just as you do for a home mortgage, you can have an adjustable mortgage that have a certain set, it sets, or you can have a permanent one. If you're going to do a permanent moment in terms of mortgage rate, that means you're going to pay a little bit higher in order that, and they're called points, and you pay for those points up front, and they're worked into the loan. Sometimes they build into what's called a balloon payment. That means after a certain period of time, all of what you borrowed from them is due. Most listing institutions, they're not going to call that in. That is basically a demarcation line. So after 5 years, if you're into this loan, a balloon payment is due, everything is due, and then at that point, you renegotiate the rest of the loan going forward. Sometimes institutions, since they don't have a long history with you, they will say that's what they want. In my case, I think when I first bought a building, they put that in because I was a new entity to them, what have you. And okay, but when it came down to saying, okay, I'm going to come back to you and we have demonstrated the track record. I've paid this amount off the loan, I've sold land and property, and I've designated to pay toward the loan. I have built a track record. So much so, the day came when the person who's an individual member who put their house as collateral a part of the loan, I insisted that their name and house come off of our loan. Why? Because we've demonstrated a track record. We can stand on our own. We pay all our bills, and I no longer need that security on there. One of the things we don't think about is that, we don't have to take it and do our ministry and do everything all at once. In my particular case, I had phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 involved buying the property and then renovating to get us in the property to do ministry. It wasn't until later that I did phase 2. And that, in doing phase 2, calculated how much money that I needed to do the renovation and rolled phase 2 in with phase 1 so that I'm looking at only one payment in mortgage that included not only the loan, but also, catch the word, construction loan, rolled in together. And that one payment covered the entirety of it all. You build up a reputation by the consistency of paying on time, paying it down. That builds up there, and that increases their ability of trust in you as an institution, that you are a viable contributor to the community in what you're doing. Can't sell it short enough about your reputation, what you do. So that means there are moments in ministry that, yes, you ought to make in the front line of the headline of the paper that says, so-and-so church is doing so-and-so in community, and that's their rep, and that's about who they are. This is important. Other things they look at is demographics. They're looking at your particular building, and they want to say, okay, on this building, if for some reason this church no longer existed, what can they sell this building for? What purpose can it be used for? That helps to calculate the value of your building and value of what you're doing. So that's important. So understand that that's in the picture. They're going to be looking at that. So they're going to look at demographics. What is the employment rate going on in your community? Whether or not you have the diversification of employment. You live in a small town and there's only one company and they hire most of the people, well, that puts you more at risk. Because if that company goes out of business, X number of people in your ministry will not have a job, which means they will not give to your ministry, and it prohibits you from paying your bill. So that is what you want in your context of understanding the environment that you're operating in. I know my particular church and my building, what have you. What I recognize is that I bought a building that was not and had never served as a church. I renovated and put it into a church and made it in a church functional to what our needs are. What I also understand is that if for some reason we decided we want to sell that Who could I sell my building to and for what purpose? Is it only a church? Because if it's only a church, that's why I've got lots of churches that are empty, nobody in there, and they're sitting there. Why? Because no one wants to buy a church because of the functionality of the building. But if the building can be used for another function, that increases your value. So if you decide you want to move out of there and want to go to another place, who will be able, or who would want to take it and buy your building? And that's what they're looking at. So that's important to understand the environment that you're in. Economic diversity, employment, what income that's coming in the community. Those things are important. They want to know. And they will do the homework on it. You ought to do your homework on it. So when you're sitting across the table, you can provide an accurate narrative to them that supports your case that they ought to invest in this ministry and what you want to do.